Before we begin, a quick note about how this episode was created. This episode uses AI-generated narration to bring Dr. Jackal's voice and character to life. However, the ideas, framing, and wording are my own. Dr. Alyssa R. Jones. The content has been synthesized, paraphrased, and adapted from history of psychology textbooks, scholarly work, lectures, professors, and other educational resources that have shaped my understanding of psychology, science, philosophy, and the mind. AI is used as a creative teaching tool, but the educational interpretation, organization, and teaching perspective come from me. Some wording may be condensed or adapted for clarity, accessibility, and narrative flow. This episode is designed to support learning, discussion, and historical engagement, and to invite students into the ideas, not replace the original sources. Episode 5. Wundt and the Founding of Experimental Psychology. Welcome back to Dr. Jackal's History and Systems of Psychology podcast, where we trace the strange, brilliant, and occasionally messy road that made psychology into a science. I'm Dr. Jackal, your lab mascot guide through the instruments, laboratories, theories, controversies, and surprisingly strict introspection rules that built modern psychology. Today's episode features Wilhelm Wundt, which means we are entering the laboratory with very serious instruments and absolutely no casual introspection allowed. In this episode, we are not just memorizing a timeline, we are tracking how psychologists changed what counted as evidence, what counted as science, and what counted as the mind in the first place. Last time, we met the physiologists and psychophysicists. We saw Miller's specific nerve energies, Helmholtz's nerve conduction research, Weber's thresholds, and Fechner's mathematical relationship between physical stimulation and mental sensation. Those developments gave psychology something crucial: measurement. Today, Wundt takes those tools and builds something new around them. Not just an experiment, not just a theory. A discipline. Part 1. Wundt before the laboratory. Wilhelm Wundt began as a researcher in physiology. He lectured part-time at the University of Heidelberg and conducted research in a makeshift laboratory at home. He was interested in developing a new science of psychology. That is important. Wundt was not simply doing isolated experiments. He was trying to create a field. He wanted psychology to stand on its own as an independent science. And to understand how he got there, we need to return briefly to Bessel's personal equation. Remember Bessel's work from episode 3? Astronomers had discovered that different observers recorded the timing of the same event differently. That meant the human observer was not a neutral instrument. The observer had to be studied. Wundt was inspired by this problem. If observers differ in perception and timing, then perhaps mental processes themselves can be measured. That idea led to one of Wundt's early instruments, the Gedankenmesser. That word means thought meter, or mind gauge. And yes, that is a magnificent name. Part 2. The thought meter. Wundt modified a pendulum clock so that it presented both a visual stimulus and an auditory stimulus. The visual stimulus was a pendulum swinging back and forth past a fixed point. The auditory stimulus was a bell. Wundt used the device to measure the mental process of perceiving the two stimuli, and in this early experiment, Wundt himself was the only subject, a very 19th century move. Based on this experiment, Wundt believed that it was impossible to perceive two things at exactly the same moment. He found that he could attend either to the sound of the bell or to the sight of the pendulum, but not both with equal clarity at once. He estimated that it took about 1/8 of a second to register both stimuli sequentially. This suggested that attention operates in sequence. We cannot clearly attend to more than one thing at the exact same time. That idea has modern relevance. Research on multitasking, such as texting while driving, supports the general point that attention is limited. We can switch rapidly between tasks, but we do not truly give full attention to multiple demanding tasks at once. Wundt's experiment was not perfect, and Fechner had already done important work measuring mental phenomena before him. But Wundt's work was part of a larger project. He was helping build the foundation for a new science. Part 3. Why Wundt is called the founder. Wundt is considered the founder of psychology as a formal academic discipline. He established the first laboratory dedicated to experimental psychology. He edited the first journal for the new science. He trained students. He built an institutional home for psychology. He began experimental psychology as an organized scientific discipline. He studied sensation, perception, attention, feeling, reaction, and association. Now this raises an important question. Why is Wundt usually called the founder of experimental psychology and not Fechner? After all, Fechner had already measured sensation and developed psychophysical methods. The answer has to do with the difference between originating and founding. Originating an idea means contributing something important, new, or foundational. Founding a discipline is different. Founding is deliberate. It involves organizing previous knowledge, creating institutions, training followers, establishing methods, publishing research, and promoting the new field to a broader scientific community. Fechner made brilliant contributions, but he was not trying to found a new science of psychology. Fechner wanted to understand the relationship between the mental and material worlds. Wundt wanted to promote psychology as an independent science. That is the difference. Fechner contributed essential tools. Wundt built the institutional structure. Neither man created psychology from nothing. Psychology emerged from a long line of thinkers, philosophers, physiologists, psychophysicists, and experimentalists. But Wundt gave it a laboratory, a journal, a training model, and a scientific identity. That is why he receives the founder title. Part 4. Wundt at Leipzig. Wundt worked as a professor of philosophy at the University of Leipzig for 45 years. There he founded his famous laboratory. He also founded the journal Philosophical Studies, which served as the official publication of the new laboratory and the new science of psychology. Later, the journal was renamed Psychological Studies. That renaming is symbolic. Psychology was becoming more visible as its own discipline. Wundt's laboratory attracted a large number of students. Many were American. They studied with Wundt, learned his methods, and then returned to the United States to open laboratories of their own. In this way, Wundt's laboratory became a model for experimental psychology around the world. Labs began appearing in Italy, Russia, Japan, and elsewhere. Wundt's work was especially influential in Russia. His books were translated into Russian more than into any other language. Moscow even constructed a virtual duplicate of Wundt's laboratory in 1912. Tokyo University followed by building another replica in 1920. That is influence. Wundt did not just write about psychology. He created a model that other people could copy. That is how a discipline spreads. Part 5. Wundt turns toward philosophy and culture. After establishing the laboratory, the journal, and an enormous body of experimental work, Wundt increasingly turned his attention back toward philosophy. He wrote about ethics, logic, and systematic philosophy. He also became deeply interested in what we might call social or cultural psychology. Between 1900 and 1920, Wundt produced a massive 10-volume work called Cultural Psychology. This work examined stages of human mental development as expressed in language, art, myth, social customs, law, and morals. That is a very broad vision of psychology. Wundt believed psychology had two major parts. The first was experimental psychology, the second was social or cultural psychology. He believed that simpler mental functions, such as sensation and perception, could be studied in the laboratory. But he argued that higher mental processes, such as learning, memory, language, and cultural thought, could not be fully studied through laboratory experimentation. Why? Because higher mental processes are shaped by language, history, and culture. They are not easily isolated in a lab. So Wundt believed these processes needed to be studied using methods more like those in sociology, anthropology, and social psychology. Now, later psychologists challenged this view. Eventually, researchers did develop experimental methods for studying learning, memory, language, and many other higher mental processes. But Wundt's concern was not absurd. He was recognizing that human thought is not only biological, it is also cultural, and that was an important insight. Interestingly, Wundt devoted about 10 years to developing cultural psychology, but only a small portion of later citations to his work focused on it. Only about 4% of citations to his publications were to cultural psychology. This raises a zeitgeist question. Maybe the scientific world was ready for Wundt, the laboratory founder, but not Wundt, the cultural psychologist. In America especially, psychologists were often more interested in practical, experimental, and applied approaches than in Wundt's broader cultural framework. So Wundt's cultural psychology did not become as central to the field as his laboratory work, but it is still an important part of his intellectual legacy. Part 6. Wundt's subject matter. Consciousness. Wundt adapted scientific methods for the new psychology. He wanted to study psychology in a way similar to how physical scientists studied the physical universe. This was partly shaped by the zeitgeist in physiology and philosophy. The methods of the new psychology were influenced by physiology, psychophysics, empiricism, associationism, and mechanism. Wundt's subject matter was consciousness. He wanted to study conscious experience scientifically. His system was influenced by 19th century empiricism and associationism because he believed consciousness included different parts that could be analyzed. But Wundt did not fully agree with the British empiricists and associationists. He rejected the idea that the elements of consciousness were static atoms of the mind passively connected by mechanical association. For Wundt, consciousness was active. It organized its own contents. That is crucial. Wundt was interested in the elements, contents, and structure of consciousness, but he also believed that identifying elements was only the beginning. The mind does not merely receive elements, it organizes them. Part 7. Voluntarism. Wundt's system is often called voluntarism. The word comes from volition, meaning will. Voluntarism refers to the idea that the mind has the power to actively organize its contents into higher-level thought processes. This is one way Wundt differed from strict associationists. British empiricists often emphasize the elements of experience and the laws of association. Wundt cared about elements too, but he emphasized the process of organizing or synthesizing those elements. The mind is not simply a passive machine. It is active. It selects, organizes, combines, synthesizes, attends. That is why Wundt is not just a simple reductionist. He wanted to break consciousness down into elements, but he also wanted to understand how those elements are actively organized into meaningful experience. Part 8. Immediate and mediate experience. Wundt also distinguished between mediate experience and immediate experience. This distinction is central to understanding his psychology. Mediate experience gives us information about something other than the experience itself. This is our usual way of knowing the external world. For example, if you look at a flower and say, "That is a red flower," you are describing the object. Your experience is being used as a route to knowledge about something outside you. That is mediate experience. Immediate experience, by contrast, refers to the experience itself. Instead of saying, "That is a red flower," you might attend to the immediate qualities of the experience: redness, brightness, shape, intensity, visual clarity, pleasantness. Wundt believed psychology should study immediate experience. He wanted psychologists to describe conscious experience in terms of the experience itself, not simply in terms of external objects. This mattered because Wundt wanted psychology to have its own subject matter. Physics studies the external world. Psychology studies immediate conscious experience. That is how he separated psychology from the physical sciences while still using scientific methods. For Wundt, states of consciousness were made up of mental elements that the mind actively organizes. He wanted to break the mind down into elements and component parts, just as natural scientists broke the physical universe down into elements. Some people compare Wundt's goal to Dmitri Mendeleev's periodic table of chemical elements. In that sense, Wundt was trying to develop something like a periodic table of the mind. That image captures the ambition beautifully. He wanted a systematic science of conscious experience. Part 9. Wundt's method, internal perception. If Wundt's subject matter was conscious experience, then he needed a method for observing it. The problem is obvious. Only the person having an experience can directly observe that experience. So Wundt used introspection, or the examination of one's own mental state. But Wundt did not mean casual introspection. He did not mean sitting around saying, "I feel kind of thoughtful today." Absolutely not. Wundt called his method internal perception. Internal perception had roots going back to Socrates, but Wundt applied precise experimental control to it. Introspection had already been used in physics to study light and sound, and in physiology to study the sense organs. Wundt adapted it for psychology under strict laboratory conditions. His goal was to produce accurate observations that could be replicated. Part 10. Rules for introspection. Wundt gave explicit rules for using introspection in his laboratory. First, observers had to be able to determine when the process would be introduced. Second, observers had to be in a state of readiness or strained attention. Third, it had to be possible to repeat the observation several times. Fourth, it had to be possible to vary the experimental conditions through controlled manipulation of stimuli. That final point is especially important. Wundt was not just asking people what they experienced. He was varying the stimulus and observing how reports of conscious experience changed. That is the essence of experimental method. Change the conditions, observe the results, repeat, compare. Unlike external perception, which focuses outward on objects in the world, internal perception focuses inward on conscious experience. Wundt wanted trained observers to report immediate experience under carefully controlled conditions. Part 11. Training the observer. Wundt insisted that observers had to be rigorously trained, and by rigorously, I mean intensely. Observers were required to complete about 10,000 individual introspective observations before they could provide meaningful data in Wundt's laboratory. 10,000. That is not tell me how you feel. That is a disciplined observational skill. Wundt wanted observers who could make observations almost mechanically. They had to quickly attend to the conscious experience being observed. He did not want them to pause and reflect too much. He wanted the interval between observing and reporting to be minimal. Why? Because if observers reflected too long, they might distort the experience, they might interpret it, theorize about it, or turn it into immediate experience. Wundt wanted immediate reports of immediate experience. His trained observers usually provided quantitative judgments, such as the size, intensity, or duration of physical stimuli. From these objective data, Wundt drew inferences about the elements and processes of conscious experience. Part 12. Wundt's 3 goals for psychology. Wundt outlined 3 goals for psychology. First, analyze conscious processes into their basic elements. Second, discover how those elements are synthesized or organized. Third, determine the laws of connection governing the organization of those elements. This gives Wundt's psychology a clear structure. Find the elements, study the organization, discover the laws. He identified sensations as one elementary form of experience. Sensations are aroused whenever a sense organ is stimulated and the resulting impulse reaches the brain. Sensations could be classified by intensity, duration, and sense modality. Sense modality refers to the type of sense involved, such as vision, hearing, touch, taste, or smell. Wundt did not find fundamental differences between sensations and images. He believed images were also associated with excitation of the cerebral cortex. The second elementary form of experience was feelings. Sensations and feelings occur together as aspects of immediate experience. Sensations are connected to stimulation of sense organs. Feelings are the subjective complements of sensations. A sensation is not experienced as bare information. It often has a feeling tone. It may be pleasant or unpleasant, tense or relaxing, exciting or calming. That led Wundt to his theory of feelings. Part 13. Wundt's tridimensional theory of feelings. Wundt proposed a tridimensional theory of feelings based on his introspective observations. One of his key tools was a metronome. While listening to the metronome, Wundt noticed that some rhythmic patterns felt more pleasant or agreeable than others. This led him to identify the first dimension of feeling: pleasure, displeasure. A feeling could be located somewhere along a continuum from highly agreeable to highly disagreeable. Then Wundt noticed another kind of feeling. As he listened to the metronome clicks, he felt a slight tension while anticipating each sound, followed by relief after the sound occurred. This led him to identify a second dimension: tension and relaxation. Then he changed the rate of the metronome. When he increased the speed of the clicks, he felt mildly excited. When he slowed the clicks, he felt calmer. This led to the third dimension: excitement, depression. So Wundt believed feelings could be described along 3 independent dimensions: pleasure, displeasure, tension, relaxation, and excitement, depression. He believed every elementary feeling could be located within this 3-dimensional space. In this way, emotions could be reduced to mental elements. Now, Wundt's tridimensional theory of feelings has not survived as a major modern theory, but historically, it shows his larger goal. He wanted even subjective feelings to be described systematically. He wanted conscious experience to be mapped, classified, and studied scientifically. Part 14. Unity, Wholeness, and Apperception. Wundt recognized something very important. When we look at objects in the real world, we do not usually experience isolated fragments. We do not experience only brightness, color, shape, angle, and texture separately. We experience whole objects. There is unity, there is organization, there is wholeness. So Wundt needed a way to explain how unified conscious experience emerges from elementary sensations and feelings. His answer was apperception. Apperception is the active process of organizing mental elements into a whole. It involves creative synthesis, also called the law of psychic resultance. This means that when mental elements combine, they can produce new properties that were not present in the elements by themselves. This should sound familiar. John Stuart Mill had proposed a similar idea with mental chemistry. Wundt also rejected the idea that mental compounds are merely the sum of their parts. For him, apperception is active. The mind acts on elemental sensations and feelings, creatively organizing them into unified experience. This is one of the most important parts of Wundt's system. Even though he studied elements, he was not simply reducing the mind to passive pieces. The mind organizes. The mind synthesizes. The mind creates structure. That makes Wundt more complex than the stereotype of him as someone who only wanted to break consciousness into bits. Wundt's psychology was foundational, but it had limits. One major issue was that his psychology was not especially useful for solving real-world problems. That made it less attractive in the pragmatic climate of the United States. American psychologists increasingly wanted psychology to do things: improve education, help industry, support mental health, measure individual differences, solve social problems, inform law, business, and public life. Wundt was not especially interested in applying psychology to practical concerns. He wanted psychology to be a pure science of immediate conscious experience. Another major issue was his method. Internal perception, or introspection, was vulnerable to criticism. At its core, introspective observation is self-observation. It is private. Other people cannot directly verify your conscious experience. Even with strict training and controlled conditions, critics questioned whether introspective reports could be reliable enough to support a science. Later schools of psychology attacked Wundt's approach. Gestalt psychology criticized elementism and emphasized organized wholes. Psychoanalysis focused on unconscious processes rather than immediate conscious experience. Functionalism emphasized what mental processes do and how they help organisms adapt. Behaviorism rejected consciousness as psychology's subject matter and insisted on observable behavior. In the United States, functionalism and behaviorism especially overshadowed Wundt's psychology. But that does not make Wundt unimportant. Quite the opposite. Wundt gave later psychologists something to build from and push against. That is how fields develop. A founder does not have to be right about everything. A founder creates a structure that makes the next arguments possible. Part 16. Wundt's historical importance. Wundt's importance lies in the fact that he gave psychology an institutional and methodological foundation. He established a laboratory, he trained students, he founded a journal, he created a research program. He defined psychology as the science of conscious experience. He insisted that mental processes could be studied under controlled conditions. He treated psychology as an independent discipline. That changed everything. Before Wundt, psychology was emerging. After Wundt, psychology had a place to stand. It had a laboratory, it had students, it had publications, it had methods, it had a name. And once that happened, other schools could emerge in response. Structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, Gestalt psychology, psychoanalysis, cognitive psychology. All of them are part of the longer story that Wundt helped make possible. That is why we study him. Not because his system won permanently, it did not. We study him because he helped create the field in which later psychologists could argue, revise, reject, and rebuild. Wrap up. The big takeaway from today's episode is that psychology changed through argument, measurement, method, and cultural pressure. The names matter. Wundt matters. Fechner matters. Bessel matters. Helmholtz, Weber, and the physiologists matter too. But the pattern matters more. Each figure or school is responding to a problem left behind by the last one. If Fechner showed that mental phenomena could be measured, Wundt built a discipline around that possibility. If physiology showed that sensation and reaction could be studied experimentally, Wundt used those methods to study consciousness. If empiricism asked how experience is built, Wundt asked how conscious experience is organized. And if Wundt founded experimental psychology, later psychologists would challenge nearly every part of his system. That is not a weakness. That is the beginning of a science. Dr. Jackal is signing off for now. The past has spoken, the methods are still on trial, and the next episode is already waiting in the wings.